down we go, my beloved truth seekers, through the amnesia of the various heavens guarded by the archons of memory blackouts, deep into the world of suffering matter, losing ourselves in a swale of illusion. Down and down we go, forgetting all that was once angelic in us, that soul that sang with the magnitude of 1,000 supernovas, yet was small enough to fit in the tears of the hymning Sophia when she first recognized her own father and mother, Barbelo and the Virgin Spirit. Down and deep and hard we fell like Lucifer, Icarus, Photos, Achamoth, Jesus, and even Superman in the last movie. All of them gleams of something cleaner, more real, and vastly more good.
But where is it written that all our dreams must be small ones?
And then we were welcomed to the machine, the black iron prison, and the domain of the God of this world. You know it as creation, heaven, hell, and especially earth. From the heights of the amaranthine, august, and ecstatic symphony of seraphic light, we became moribund scraps of monkey flesh bungling in the jungle.
Those acts of God really stick it in and break it off, don't they?
Like the Nag Hammadi Library's Gospel of Philip says, the world was made by a mistake. And like the interpretation of knowledge from the same book says, for this world is the work of beasts. And why is that, you may wonder? Simple. God went crazy and became us. That is the Gnostic story in a nutshell. And you may ask, how could that have happened? It's not logical that perfection would go Britney Spears, right? Well, sorry my skeptics and free thinkers, but there are limits to logic. At certain intersections, logic is of no use. Saying, for example, this statement is a lie, or saying the Big Bang happened before time, are logical paradoxes. Asking what would happen if there were no rhetorical questions is also another conundrum.
Who knows? I may pick up a rock and it'll say underneath, made by God. The universe is full of surprises.
Our spiritual ancestors, the Gnostics and Kabbalists, knew the limits of reason and logic, and through transcendental flights into the realms of truthful imagination, they understood the truth but not logic, that perfection became less than perfect in the task of understanding itself. We are God gone crazy. We are trying to rectify it though, and that can only be done with an awakening of the spirit and mind, by feeling the truth like a spike, undergoing the mysteries of the ancients, and the direct experience with our past godhood they call gnosis.
It is a journey of evolution, adaptation, the journey we all take, the journey that unites each and every one of us.
And you will recall some of it here at the Virtual Alexandria on this approximately Saturday, April 12, 2008, the year of our demiurge. I am and I am Abraxas. I am me, but what I see is you because you are me. I am beyond the I am bush that burned one day to tell lies to Moses.
Jesus, why does God hate me? Huh?
So how about a little tobacco? Maybe some cheap coffee or just snort some Mountain Dew? How about something politically incorrect? Because good health and mental stability are two of the cruelest jokes Yaldabaoth, another name for Jehovah, played on us. The Lord giveth, the Lord taketh with so much pleasure. Politically correctness and save the children mentality are for those who wish to control your heart, mere extensions of the angelic mafia that rules the universe and hardens the armor of your own ego.
What if this is as good as it gets?
So now that you're feeling good about yourself, we'll now break some more of that armor and expose you to more of the truth like spikes. And that truth is the monster called by Christians the Old Testament. Our guest is Gary Greenberg, author of 101 Myths of the Bible, The Moses Mystery, and The Judas Brief, as well as president of the Biblical Archaeological Society of New York, and we'll be discussing his exceptional book, 101 Myths of the Bible. And by myths we mean falsehoods, myths with a little m, not a big M. This book isn't your usual aha, gotcha excrement you see in atheist rags or websites. You know, where they argue that certain qubits are mathematically wrong for a building or vessel, virgin doesn't mean virgin, or that Jesus couldn't see all the kingdoms of the world from a mountaintop. These are tiring polemics that will never convince the fundamentals anyway.
And on the third day, God created the Remington bolt-action rifle so that man could fight the dinosaurs and the homosexuals.
Amen.
No, Gary's book is a multi-layered opus that reveals a process, sociology, anthropology, theology, and much more in how the Old Testament came about. He meticulously educates us on how Judaism wasn't born in a vacuum like literalists would like us to believe, but is a massive stew with other cultures used as seasoning. Sure, Gary has no problem feeding us the contradictions, anachronisms, silly mistakes, barbarity, and plain odd dogma found in the Jewish scriptures.
We will not live by your commandments, we're free!
There is no freedom without the law.
It's all there better than most books, if you read it literally. That's the big catch, if you read it literally. Something both the orthodox and the militant atheists have to do because they have been programmed by Jehovah to understand only one dimension of their false identity.
That's crazy talk.
If you explore the Old Testament as metaphor, through Kabbalist eyes, with Midrash and rabbinical wisdom, it is indeed one of the premier gateways to spiritual individuation. It is a gift from the true God of light, filled with esoteric secrets, timeless ethics, and the foundation to so much occult wonder. But if you read it literally, it's just a disaster, my beloved truth seekers. I think it was Robert Ingersoll who mentioned that if in these days you followed the Old Testament literally, you would end up in jail. Tells you about the real cowardice of fundamentals, doesn't it? They arbitrarily obey the inerrant word of God when it suits them. Why aren't they stoning gays or killing witches? Why aren't there signs on the streets about oxen right-of-ways or kosher white castles? Never mind, their apologetics are as bad as their hypocrisy.
And may the Christian Lord guide my hand against your Roman popery!
But if you read the Tanakh through the eyes of the Gnostic, you'll find yourself looking out of the prison that is your body and glimpse at the kingdom of the Father, or the palm tree garden as Philip K. Dick called it. Make your choice, but understand the horrible damage that literalists have done. Today the Abrahamic religions are ready to fill the streets with blood and the skies with nuclear deodorant over one small fact in Genesis. One little fact. And that is a stupid story about the two sons of the never-existed Abraham, and they are Isaac and Ishmael. The Jews, backed by the Orthodox Christians, believe they are the descendants of Isaac and the chosen people. Muslims believe the opposite, that Ishmael is the patriarch of all man and, or more like, the chosen race. And this mentality, egoistic adrenaline and subconscious growing of hatred, has stood for centuries between several religions. And here we are in the lovely 21st century.
We're the middle children of history, man. No purpose or place. We have no great war, no great depression. Our great war is a spiritual war. Our great depression is our lives.
That's just scratching the rash. Think about all the hidden prophecies that have created Christians who can't wait for global bloodshed while they wait to be teleported to the palace of Jehovah and sing bad hymns to him for the rest of eternity. or Muslims who want to eradicate Israel or any secular government that gets in the way, or antique laws that still oppress women, homosexuals, the sick, the crippled, and other minorities.
Yea, believe in me and ye shall find peace.
Yeah, we've heard that crap for about 2,000 years now. We want to hear something new. It's the year 2000, for Christ's sake.
And thanks be to Sophia that a book like Gary clears this up, not by only showing the shams of the Jewish Bible, but also positively exposing the soup from which the great Jewish myths originated from Sumeria to Babylon, from Egypt to Greece, from Rome to the diaspora. How many times do I have to say that no religion exists in a vacuum? All religions cross-pollinate, but at least the Gnostics philosophically admitted this. It's a pity we could only take a brief safari of Gary Greenberg's 100 Myths of the Bible in our interview, so I advise you to buy it pronto. It's well written and works like a reference book that will impress the fundamentalists and militant atheists who think they've got it all figured out in their own battles to destroy Western culture.
There are two kinds of evil people. People who do evil stuff and people who see evil stuff being done and don't try to stop it.
Jehovah had so many pawns. Sometimes I wonder why I even bother to get out of my coffin in the morning. Besides the fact I really need a cigarette and a cup of mint tea. But then I think of you, Hypatia of Alexandria, the Gnostics' patron saint and last true seeker before the Dark Ages. And it makes it worth it. And sometimes, for a strange reason, I think of the words in the first book of Timothy, which isn't even written by St. Paul, but nonetheless I think about them. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. Now there is in store for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day, and not only me, but also to all who have longed for his appearing.
There is no going back. Our enemy pushes us on and on and on, and until we're strong enough or can find Earth and get help, we can never stop or turn away or look back.
But enough of my drivel, my beloved true seeker. Let's find out together what the Old Testament is really about, and hopefully what we, as children of light, are about as well. Hello and goodbye as always.
Let me give you a little inside information about God. God likes to watch. He's a prankster. Think about it. He gives man instincts. He gives you this extraordinary gift, and then what does he do? I swear, for his own amusement, his own private cosmic gag reel, he sets the rules in opposition. It's the goof of all time. Look, but don't touch.
We are at the Coffee, Cigarettes, and Gnosis interview. Today we have Gary Greenberg, and we will be discussing his eye-opening book, 101 Myths of the Bible. How are you doing today, Gary?
Oh, good. How are you?
Good. I'm doing just wonderful. Thank you very much for showing up to the show and talking about it. And what exactly made you decide to write such a, I would say, controversial book?
Well, there were two parts of it. One was probably the key motivator, but the other was part of the essential broad interest. The latter part was just the idea of where did the stories come from. The overriding imperative that pushed me was the degree to which Egyptian literature is completely ignored in biblical studies, and vice versa. The Egyptologists and biblical scholars just don't want to engage in each other's field and sort of have a papyrus curtain between them and refuse to discuss with each other, for the most part, the parallels and materials except in the most simplistic way. So I thought it would be useful to get some of the Egyptian material out into the discussion area. And I just thought it was generally interesting to place Israel's history in the context of its neighbors.
Yeah, because it's not just Egypt, right? Don't
Right.
they have? It's also Sumerian, Babylonian,
Right.
and
Greece.
other. Yeah, they
influences.
all.
You know, you have the Philistines coming in and the Sea Peoples, who are basically from the Greek culture, and they're bringing materials in. And, you know, there's seems to be some fairly clear connections, at least in the biblical tradition, with Israel associating with some of those groups. Particularly, for example, the tribe of Dan has some clear connotations of being one of the Sea Peoples, and Samson is clearly living among the Philistines rather than the Israelites for the most purposes. So you have these questions that are in the background that need to be explored.
In other words, there's just like any religion, there's always cross-pollination, no
Right.
matter how much you'd like to claim yours is original.
Yeah, and one of the things that's bothered me, not bothered me, but I sort of anticipated, and I don't understand the complaint, if on a theological level you believe a lot of these stories are true, it would make sense that other cultures that are around at the same time and earlier would know of the similar stories. So why shouldn't we expect them to have these variations of the stories even earlier? But the logic of that seems to not penetrate into biblical studies.
And why don't we go through some of them? I wish we could go through all 101, but why don't we travel through time and see what we can uncover? What would you say are some of the 2 or 3 most blatant mistakes or interesting facts in the Genesis account?
Okay, well, you know, one of the classic problems in the Genesis accounts is that Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 pretty much contradict each other in the sequence of creation. And there are also differences in how the deity is portrayed and what Adam and Eve consist of, basically. And the assumption is the Adam in Genesis 2 and the Adam in Genesis 1 are the same, when they clearly appear to be different entities. You know, Genesis 1, Adam is created male and female. It's a very strange concept. And when you look at some of the Egyptian creation myths, which I think were very heavily influential in the development of the biblical creation myths, you find creator deities that share male and female characteristics. In Genesis 2, you're dealing with a more human-like character, Adam created before the animals, and then Eve created afterwards in a different kind of transaction. So these stories clearly have different backgrounds, and one of the things that's very difficult to get across initially is the range of Egyptian creation stories, because they're really not something most people are familiar with unless you tend to study Egyptology. But there were 4 main Egyptian cult centers, each with their own traditions, and each had variations. And they were all very influential. And the Egyptians didn't really bother sorting out contradictions very much. They just sort of had different centers and they had different variations. The 2 oldest were Heliopolis, which the Bible refers to as On, O-N in the Bible, and Hermopolis. And in the Bible, Joseph is married to the daughter of the chief priest of On. So you already have a traditional connection there between the head of the Israelite people and the temple in On and the priesthood in On and the religious myths of that tradition. And that's fairly much reflected a lot, I think, in the biblical history.
And for the listener, Gary breaks down almost every passage in Genesis and shows you the mythology and contradictions, errors, and so forth. So we could probably spend a whole show just on Genesis.
Yeah. One of the things that it has to be understood is that even though I say it started out that way, there was evolution, development, other cultural cross-influences, and clearly at some point the Babylonian culture became very heavily influential and affected and modified and changed many of the stories as they were passed on. But, one of the important Egyptian creation myths from the Hermopolis cult, which is one of the two oldest, involves, although they're portrayed as frogs and serpents, basically, 4 males and 4 females on an ocean having a son. In the Egyptian myth, it's the child Ra, who grows up to be the god Ra and becomes the creator god. In some of the traditions, he created his own parents. But when you look at the story of 4 males and 4 females floating on an ocean, giving birth to a son, you sort of have to go back to the Noah story, which is 4 males, 4 females floating on an ocean, giving birth to a son. And when you read the story, it's very, when you talk, they're very problematic questions when you read the story about the son as to who the father is. They go out of their way to sort of change, to make clear that the father must be a single person, not the group. There's some strange language in there, some real concern about the genealogy of the son.
And sometimes the name of a person in the Bible really isn't a person, but isn't it an actual tribe or enemy culture or something like that?
There can be a variety of explanations for where some of the names come from. Lands could have given names to patronymics, patronyms. Characters could have given names to the land. There's a lot of interplay, traditions. Who knows how a lot of things get named in the past. But, you look at them, over time they change. We see that names changed in times when Bible stories were being written, because frequently they tell you this isn't the name of the place anymore. It used to be known as such and such. This place that we know now as this name used to be called something else at an earlier time. And you have a few passages like that here and there.
And moving away from Genesis, we're still in Genesis, but in your book you say Cain never killed Abel. What are we missing here?
Okay. It's a little complicated, and it's a mixture of myths in there, but we're originally recreating an Egyptian myth about the fighting between 2 of the chief gods who are brothers, Seth and Horus. Horus is the younger brother, and he's killed by the older brother. And there are a number of parallels, but in the Genesis story, there's confusion in the Egyptian myth between Horus, the brother of Seth, and Horus, the nephew of Seth. There were 2 Horuses. And the parent is, the mother and father are Osiris and Isis. The mother is, there's a mother and father, and they have 3 sons, Osiris, Horus, and Seth. And in Genesis, you have the mother and father, Adam and Eve, with 3 sons, one of whom is named Seth. In the Egyptian myth, Seth kills Horus. In the biblical version, Seth is isolated out as the third brother, and the other 2 are involved. Then there's some cross currents with Babylonian myths about the death of some conflict between a farmer and the planter and the farmer and the shepherd, involving conflict with the conflict for the love of a goddess and decisions being made. So there were changes made to the story. Originally, the murders would have been the other way around.
And moving on to the flood stories, you say that the flood story was based on an Egyptian creation myth.
Yeah.
But also, I've heard that the flood story was simply borrowed from the Epic of Gilgamesh. Are we having? Is this an infusion, or what side do you?
Yeah, there was a fusing later on, and I try to trace the patterns in the book, show you what we know from the Babylonian myths and Sumerian myths, how they developed. and the changes that those myths went through and how they are reflected in the biblical accounts. Originally, the Noah story would have been a creation story parallel to the one I told you about Egypt. And those scholars who follow the documentary hypothesis analysis can see two different stories merged together in the flood story. There's two different traditions merged together with two separate chronologies. One set of chronologies is in the form of so many days passed and this happened, so many days passed and this happened, so many days passed and this happened. The other chronology is on the such and such day this happened, on this next such and such day of this year this happened. So if you separate out the two sets of chronologies by style, you create two parallel flood stories, each with their own chronology, and they both tend to, you can see that they were synced together in some way based on the Egyptian calendar cycle of 365 days in a year.
And something which I thought was amazing is that you show that there are two versions of how many animals go into the ark, yet for some reason we are all almost, brainwashed to think that there are always two of each animal going into the ark. How do people miss the other part?
It's not that they miss it; they just don't hear the story. They just hear the main story. The Golden Book or the comic book or the Classics Illustrated or whatever the popular version. The esoteric priestly rituals get set aside. They needed extra animals for sacrifices and things. So, one way it could be told, I don't like to get into how theologians would explain differences, but they can always come up with something if they want, even if it isn't a very logical explanation. But you could presumably say there were two of everything brought aboard, but that doesn't mean only two. They gathered two of everything, but they could have gathered more of others.
Right, and Jews never have a problem with Midrash or stuff like that. Their thinking is different than your typical Christian.
Right, they look at the stories very differently.
And what about the patriarch Abraham? Isn't he pretty much a legend because of certain anachronisms that are found there?
There are anachronisms, and my perspective on the whole thing is that the entire patriarchal history is based on Egyptian mythology, that the characters in the patriarchal history were originally the main Egyptian family of gods involving Ra, Osiris, Isis, Geb, Nut, Horus, Seth. Jacob and Esau are clearly Horus-Set parallels. Set was often portrayed as a red-haired, animal-like character, a mighty hunter. Esau is a red-haired, wild character, hunter that lives on, red hair. Ishmael is a similar character, lives on the Egyptian borders. His mother is Egyptian. There are clearly a lot of these parallels. We have the wrestling between Jacob and Esau. You have parallel fighting between Seth and Horus. There's an entire cycle of fighting between Seth and Horus. You have Jacob going up the ladder to heaven in the Egyptian funerary myths and legends from the pyramids in the third millennium. A key part of the tradition is, if you look at so many of these inscriptions, the ladder to heaven. There's a ladder to heaven. The deceased king is going up the ladder, and the ladder is formed out of Horus and Seth. The two gods make the ladder. Jacob and Esau make the ladder that the king would go up into heaven. So you have lots of parallels. They may not be precise, but what I think was going on, there were two kinds of operations going on. One was taking the gods and then from a monotheistic perspective of Israel saying, Well, they couldn't have been gods because there's only one God. So they must have been humans. So they transform many of the deities into human figures, saying that must be what the real story is about. The second aspect is they take characteristics of the deities and turn them into natural forces, a sun, winds, things of that sort. You know, the creation myth, you have where we traditionally read soul of God hovered over the spirit of God hovered over the waters. It's actually the breath of God, the wind, and the wind is the god Amun, one of the four creator gods in the Hermopolitan tradition. You had darkness, you had water, you had wind, you know, and empty space. The four creation pieces in Egypt are the four creation pieces in the biblical story.
And Gary, yeah, you show how, for example, the Abraham comes from Ur of the Chaldees, and there were no Chaldees for 900 years, and there's no Philistines or anything like that. But what do you know? What god Abraham might have been borrowed from, or
in
based
part,
on?
There's a split. There's two Abrahams. You have the Abram and you have Abraham. So there's a merger of two characters, one of which would be the god Ra, who's more like Abram, and then the other is, if I remember right, it's Geb, the earth god. He's the earth god in Egypt, who was married to Nut, who was the sky god. In their myth, the two of them are pulled apart by their son and held between heaven. You know, he stands between heaven and earth. And you have waters above and waters below, just like you have in the biblical creation story. But I go into some of the stories and incidents in the lives of those deities and show the parallels in the stories and the parallels in the biblical stories.
Well, that's much better than New Agers who think Abraham means Brahman. But that's what people are going to do. Anyway, Gary, in another story, which I think is a good story to destroy, is the story of Sodom and Gomorrah because of all the homophobia it's created. But needless to say, they never existed.
Right, we have no evidence for it. The stories, I think, were parallels to going into the underworld and coming back, retrieving the dead from the underworld. And I think I draw some parallels to the Orpheus and Eurydice story, the looking back and the destruction that followed, the return to death, and the language in parts of the story reflects death culture. And the real sin there was not homosexuality, but lack of hospitality. The thing that they would do, the concept of hospitality was crucial in the ancient culture. And what was being violated there was hospitality, not sex.
And doesn't the word Gomorrah itself mean something like burnt ash?
Yeah, it's a name created out of the story. You had a large salt area from the sea, the Dead Sea, the salt area, so they created legends about salt figures and pillars and things, and so they merged them into different stories.
And Gary, here's a small one, but also something that might shock people, but isn't the famous coat of many colors of Joseph also a mistake?
It's not in the Hebrew version. The Hebrew text doesn't have a coat of many colors. It's from the Greek translation, the Septuagint, which somehow created a coat of many colors. But the Hebrew text doesn't have that.
It also created a famous musical. So
yeah. The King James Version used the Greek text a lot to develop its translations, and so the King James isn't a pure Hebrew translation.
Gary, what about Exodus. Where did that one come from? Obviously not historical either, right?
Well, no. The Exodus is a real event, but not the way it's depicted in the biblical account per se. And I did a separate book on that, originally called The Moses Mystery, reprinted under the title The Bible Myth. From my perspective, what you had, and this is an awful big chunk to take off in one quick bite, but I tie in the origin of Israel into the Atonist cult of Akhenaten in Egypt. When Israel was, there was no Israel until that time period. There was a conflict between the mainstream Egyptian cults and the Akhenaten cult. Akhenaten was a kind of very heretical cult, monotheistic cult in Egypt. And after he died, shortly after, there was a lot of persecution of Akhenaten's followers. The bloodline of Akhenaten's family, the ruling family, the pharaonic line, died out, and generals started taking over. My theory was that Moses was a priest in the cult of Akhenaten, which originated in the city of Anu, which is the biblical On, Heliopolis, where Joseph was married to the high priest. And in later traditions, Moses had a reputation for being affiliated with that city. Moses fled Egypt to avoid the persecution in the crackdown. And when the general ruling Egypt died, Horemheb, it's my theory that Moses came back laying a claim to the throne, claiming to be, as an adopted member of the royal family, a rightful heir to the throne, as opposed to the general who wanted to seek the throne, Ramses I. So I have what was a borderline civil war about to start between the remnant of Akhenaten's following and enemies of the ruling class, allied with Canaanite enemies of the ruling class, seeking to put Moses in power, and the edge of a civil war that was averted at the last moment when Moses realized he wouldn't win. So there was an exodus out of Egypt of him and his followers. Not the massive exodus depicted, but an exodus of the remnant of his movement.
And they later became the Israelites?
Right. They became the core group of Israel, which I identify as the Rachel tribes, and a couple of the others. Mythologically, what I think you have is when Israel came out of Egypt, they settled in the territory initially that became known as the tribe of Reuben, which, not surprisingly, is the firstborn son of Jacob, of Israel. So the firstborn son is where they first settled. That's the connection to the firstborn son. They moved up through Jordan and then across into Canaan. And basically the Rachel tribes and their allies were the core group. And then there were Canaanite groups, and there were Philistines and Sea Peoples and other groups, some of which merged in political confederation rather than religious confederation. Then under David, you had some more consolidation.
So basically, Sigmund Freud wasn't too off the mark with his book.
Well, Sigmund Freud's book is very bizarre. It's very bad history. He basically says, he draws a connection to Moses and Akhenaten, which in his time was burgeoning theory. He wasn't original with that.
Oh.
It was growing. There was a lot of thinking, it was around that time, not much earlier, that the Akhenaten stuff had been discovered. They didn't know about him. The Egyptians had buried all his history. They tore down his structures. They wrote him out of the history. He pretty much disappeared in many ways. In the 19th century, they discovered the capital he built and began to uncover his history. And there was, as a monotheistic or apparent monotheist, there was a lot of speculation in that time that there was a connection between him and Moses. There's a famous novel, Joseph and His Brothers, I think by Hesse, showing a connection between Joseph and Akhenaten. So there was a popular tradition at that time being kicked about, and he played with it and tried to deal with it. But almost everything he does around it is pretty bad stuff, historically.
I see.
But people try to dismiss my book as just reheated Freud, even though I mention him one time only that he wrote about it, but I don't reference him.
Another small detail which most people just assume to be true is most people believe that Moses was denied entrance into the Promised Land because he hit the rock and then took, said he was the one who did it. But why was Moses truly denied entrance into the Promised Land?
He basically died.
He died?
Yeah, he wasn't a kid.
The
tradition is he's 120 years old.
And that's in the Bible.
Yeah. He died at the age of 120. In the biblical tradition, he came back at the age of 80 to lead the Exodus. So, you're 80 and 40 years in the tradition. Interestingly, there's a parallel Egyptian tradition in the struggle for the throne between competing deities. Seth and Horus struggling on the throne. The battle is going on for 80 years. Interesting concept until it's resolved. And the Egyptians themselves had a story about the Exodus and Moses, and nobody likes to admit it in biblical scholarship. And the Egyptologists try to just dismiss it as a legend. But in Egyptian tradition from the 3rd century, in a history of Egypt, written by an Egyptian priest named Manetho, he specifically traces the story of Moses to a conflict in the 18th dynasty, which is very clearly a disguised version of the conflict with Akhenaten and the Egyptian establishment. All Egyptologists know that the story is about Akhenaten. They just say that the Moses connection is just a later addition. But this story clearly says that Moses was associated with Akhenaten and that Moses rebelled, led a rebellion, and that he led his followers out of Egypt. And that's in 3rd century BCE Egyptian history. So they have a tradition clearly associating this, Moses and Akhenaten and the Exodus. But everybody wants to get rid of that story because it upsets their theories.
Indeed, I can understand why.
And that's not the only version of the story. There's another one from the 1st century.
Really?
Similar story from another Egyptian writer of the time.
And what about Joshua, the savior of the Israelites? Who really is Joshua?
Joshua seems to be something of a mythological figure. He has a name that he shouldn't have yet, because the first part of his name is for Yahweh, which hadn't actually been revealed to the Jews at that time yet. Moses first learned about it in the desert. In the desert, there's a confrontation between Moses and God after he fled Egypt, in which, according to the Bible anyhow, God reveals that his true name is Yahweh, and that none of the ancestors, Abraham, or any of them, knew that name. They only knew him as El Shaddai, El the Mighty. So Joshua shouldn't have a name involving Yahweh yet, because it hadn't been revealed to the Israelites at the time he was named. But the name seems to be a combination of Yahweh and the Egyptian god Shu, who's one of the key Egyptian gods, one of the chief creation deities. There may be a conflation of an actual leader of the Exodus crew and mythological characters.
Also, it says he's also the son of Nun.
Right.
That also means fish.
Well,
does that tie
fish,
him into some sort of fish god?
Egypt, Nun is the ocean, is the deity symbolizing the ocean that covered the entire universe. One of the 4 creation elements. the flood, the universal flood in the beginning of the Bible, in the Bible. That's also an Egyptian creation myth. Part of the four elements of the Egyptian creation myth is the universal flood that filled the universe. And it was called Nun, or Nu, or Nun in Egypt. And of course, Nun is also the first letter of Noah's name. Noah's name is actually Nun, the letter N, and Ach, which would in Egypt be something like spirit. The name may be an Egyptian derivation from spirit of the Nun.
Wow, so basically we really have a lot of creation stories flowing all through the Bible.
Yeah, but they get treated, they're constantly going through an evolution, because the monotheistic take on all these things is these can't be deities. So there must be either natural phenomenon being called deities or people who have been treated as deities.
And you also mentioned Samson at the beginning of the interview. Who is Samson, and who is he based on?
Well, Samson's a complicated character, very complicated character. While he's casually described as the Jewish or Israelite Heracles or Hercules, everybody is quick to say, but he's not really the same character. He's basically the Israelite version of Heracles, adopted from the Greek Heracles accounts, but also there are parallels between the Greek versions of the Heracles stories and the Egyptian version of the Horus god stories. But let's just deal straight on with the Heracles of Greece. Heracles is part of the Greek tribe known as the Danoi, D-A-N-O-I. This is the name that Homer gives to the Greeks that invaded Troy, the Danoi. Danoi also appear to be one of the sea peoples that came into the Canaanite nation in the 12th century. So when one of the tribes of Israel is Dan, and Samson is of the tribe of Dan, and we're told that Dan in one of the stories is a people that abides on their ships. So we have close parallels suggesting that the Danai settled in Canaan as part of the Sea Peoples movement in the 12th century, along with the Philistines. And they brought with them probably their own myths, one of which was Heracles, one of the key mythological figures in the Danoi culture. And many of the characteristics, Heracles wore a lion skin head. Samson has the lion skin head. There's many parallels in the story. Heracles, in many aspects, is a solar figure. Samson is a solar figure. The long hair is a traditional solar figure concept. Solar symbols are like horses with manes, lions with manes. The long hair is a solar symbol. We have day-night symbolism. Delilah is the night. So you have the night in conflict with the sun. You have Samson going in circle.
Isn't Samson's name itself give us a clue?
Yeah, Samson means sun man.
Well, that's one right there.
Right. So again, there's a tendency to try to dismiss these things, as just coincidences or whatever. But we clearly have parallel stories in many incidents, and I try to expand on some of them in the book. And it's not just in that one instance. We find other areas where there are parallels. I go into a number of places into the Greek traditions involving the Danoi, including their tribal breakdown myths and things of that, and you begin to see parallels in the Israelite tribal breakdown myths in terms of the number of tribes, the number of members, things of that sort.
Yes, your book definitely covers a lot of ground. There's the reader will have no doubts, and it's a great reference book too. So again, I definitely recommend it. I highly recommend this book. And again, what I love is your sometimes little things that most people just completely miss.
Mm-hmm.
Like, for example, tell us who really killed Goliath.
Well, yeah, that's an interesting one, really an intriguing story. There are two different versions in the Bible, and it created problems for them later on. In one version is the traditional David story of David as a kid going out and killing Goliath. But buried deep in Samuel, the book of Samuel, there's another story about the killing of Goliath, in which it's conceptually placed in David's old age, as becoming a feeble king almost, in which he was almost killed in battle, and it's a fight with the Philistines. There are 4 battles described with giants, and Goliath is one of the giants in the 4 battles. And we're told that Goliath was killed by Elhanan, one of the bodyguards to David. So we have a second story. David is an old man, and Goliath is still around, and one of his bodyguards kills Goliath in battle. The question then becomes, which one, if not both, is the myth? The Goliath story was part of efforts. The David-Goliath story was part of efforts to create a backstory for him to explain how he rose so fast in Saul's court and everything. But there are many, many problems with the David-Goliath story. A lot of conflicts in the story. Saul doesn't seem to know who he is after bringing him into the court, doesn't know who the father is after having him come home from his father. There's so many conflicts in the story. It's clear that the David story was a later addition to the corpus. But in later times, the David story was so important to the culture, so that in Chronicles you have a variation of the story in which they insert brother of. And in the King James Version, they go back to Samuel and insert brother of into the text where it doesn't appear in the Hebrew. So they try to say Goliath, that the giant killed was the brother of Goliath, not Goliath. The Hebrew text doesn't have brother of. The King James Version put that in, again using the Septuagint as a guide. But that was an attempt to correct a problem perceived in the later times with the story. David wasn't all that popular a character throughout Israelite history. He was just one side in a political struggle with the Israelites. He was much hated by the Israelites in his lifetime, and the feuding was sufficiently strong so that after Solomon died, the kingdom split in two. The Judean kingdom was not liked by most of Israel. So a long anti-David tradition survived down into late times, and part of the writing of David's story involves trying to refute the charges against him that have survived.
But what about the story of the Davidic Empire and Solomon Empire? I mean, obviously archaeology hasn't proven it, but
right.
Why create this great myth of this great empire?
Yeah, there's a question of how big it actually was, if it existed at all. I'm of the belief that there was something, not as extensive, more of an alliance through much of Canaan with allies and conflicts, a lot of intermarriage. I think the Philistines were a lot more dominant, and I think David was, for much of his reign, a Philistine vassal who had a close working relationship with the Philistines. He basically served them, and he was, a chief bodyguard to one of the chief Philistine kings. It's in the biblical text. And I think he was just subservient to the Philistines. I think Israel, after it split off from Judah, became a fairly large kingdom. And I think tradition incorporated that to a large extent into David's kingdom at later time. I think it's Baruch Halpern in his book on David's Demons, I think it's called, does a lot of analysis of trying to read the text in context to see how extensive the kingdom might really have been. And I think he talks about if there was a single conflict or battle, they turn it into a conquest and things of that sort.
So David was basically more of a tribal chief.
Well, he was not so much a tribal chief. I think he developed a regional base. He was a Philistine vassal while Saul was king. He set himself up as king over Hebron and surrounding areas after killing off the Hebronite leaders, marrying the Hebronite leader's wife, Abigail. He established a kingdom and was running around conquering territory. He had a fairly substantial army behind him, a kind of a mercenary army that joined up with him, several hundred men, which is a fairly substantial army in those days. But he worked as a vassal for the king of Gath. And so he independently became king over what he created, basically Judah, and then went to civil war with Israel. And Israel was probably primarily the central core and Jordan, the territory of Benjamin, some Manasseh surrounding it, and a little of Jordan. And there was a couple of years of civil war. David was actually the third king of Israel, not the second king. The second king of Israel was Eshbal, or known as Ishbosheth later. He was Saul's successor as king of Israel. He ruled for 2 years before being assassinated, probably by hitmen from David. And then David finally conquered Israel militarily and became the ruler.
Well, where can we find this information about the second king? Is that
it's in Samuel.
Oh, it's in Samuel. Okay,
yeah.
So it's right there.
We have the whole story of the conflict, the civil war. There's a civil war for 2 years. David is ruling in Hebron. Ishbal is ruling from the remnants of his kingdom on the Jordan side. Abner, after Saul is killed, Abner becomes general of Saul's army, puts Ishbal on the throne. We have stories of the conflict between Ishbal and David, and the murder of Abner by Joab, David's chief hitman. And after Abner's murder, basically Ishbal was assassinated, and the opposition to David collapses.
And there is historical veracity in Solomon, and basically Solomon's son being the one who, as I say, really screwed things up.
No, Solomon screwed it up a lot. We started out, David was hated by Israel. They thought he murdered Saul, and there were several rebellions against David, led by the Benjaminites on one side and by his own family practically on the other side. Absalom, his son, also led a big rebellion against David on the principle that David didn't provide justice for the people. And so the Judeans were rallying to Absalom's side in opposition to David because David basically didn't provide justice. Solomon developed a legend as being a great judge, sort of to try to counter this image of David as a terrible judge. And the story of Solomon is very short and clearly divided into two parts, a pro-Solomon piece and an anti-Solomon piece. And he's clearly alienating people right and left in the anti-Solomon part. He's marrying all these foreign wives, builds an Egyptian temple in Jerusalem for one of his wives. And during Solomon's reign, there's a rebellion led by Jeroboam, one of the captains he appointed to oversee the conscription and taxing of part of Israel. Jeroboam leads a rebellion against Solomon. Solomon launches a counterstrike. Jeroboam escapes to Egypt and is protected by the Egyptian pharaoh. There's obviously a change of administration from the pharaoh whose daughter Solomon married to a new dynasty or a new pharaoh. After Solomon dies, Jeroboam comes back from Egypt and is now leading the Israelites in negotiation with Solomon's successor. Basically, they lay out a very strong litany about what a horrible king Solomon was. Conscription, taxes, a beastly ruler. And they say, you've got to lighten the load. I mean, Solomon was terrible. Rehoboam, Solomon's son, who appears to have been an Ammonite, goes back and talks to two groups of rulers, advisors, the old, the graybeards, the old guys, and the young guys, the hotheads. And the old guys are telling Rehoboam, they're not asking for you much. Tell them you go along with them, and they'll make you king. And the young guys are saying, you don't have to listen to these guys. You're the king. You tell them what to do. And Rehoboam goes back to Jeroboam, and he says, you think my father was bad? He whipped you with chains. I'm going to chastise you with scorpions. And so Israel says, screw you. We don't need you. We're another country now. And they break off. And that's how you got the split between Israel and Judah.
And the rest is history until the Assyrians came.
Well, yeah, what you then have is a more successful, more powerful Israel. We have records that show that Israel became a fairly big, powerful nation for a while under Omri and his son, Jezebel's husband. Omri became a fairly powerful king later on. As a matter of fact, the Assyrians referred to Israel as Bet Omri, House of Omri. And there was conflict, but Israel provided a strong history of anti-David propaganda that was preserved down for a very long time. So that's why you have so much apologetic in the stories of Sam and David's history, trying to counter the anti-David attacks.
Well, Gary, I think that's about all the time we have, and I want to remind the listener that we have barely scratched maybe 1% of 101 myths of the Bible, so please check it out, and like I said at the beginning, it's very eye-opening. But I'd like to thank you very much, Gary, for appearing on